So today we're going to be running through some tips and tricks when it comes to some of the more advanced features of pivot tables. So I'm going to make a small assumption that most of the people attending today have at least some experience of using pivot tables. Now, if you are joining us today and you are more of a beginner, I will say don't worry too much. I am going to run through a quick recap of the basics. I'm just not going to spend too long going through all of the basics of pivot tables because I want to get on to some of the more intermediate to advanced features fairly quickly. Now, I will say that pivot tables is probably the most requested topic that I get in Excel. And for me, that indicates that not only it's the most important tool when it comes to data analysis, but also that people crave additional knowledge as there is so much that you can do with them. And sometimes it's not completely obvious how you utilize some of the features within pivot tables. So we've got an hour, so I can't go through absolutely everything. As always, I've cherry-picked a few things, and as always, I will be trying to throw in as many keyboard shortcuts and little helpful pro tips as we go through. So let's take a look at our agenda. So as I mentioned, I am going to do a little bit of a pivot tables recap, which isn't really going to extend too much beyond creating a pivot table from scratch. I'm going to talk a little bit about formatting values and also custom pivot table styles. We're going to take a look at sorting and filtering pivot data and also creating and formatting pivot charts. I'm going to go through some of the options like summarizing values and also showing values as something else, which you may or may not have used before. And something that's quite fun that I thought I'd throw in because it does showcase quite a few different elements. It showcases slicers and also some of the newer functions, and that is creating dynamic pivot chart labels. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about using calculated fields, and we're also going to do some work with slicers. So that is our agenda. I'm going to try and get through as much of it as I can and not waffle on too much, which I do have a tendency to do. So let's jump out of here and I'm going to switch across to the Excel spreadsheet that we're going to be using today. Now, just on a side note, I have dropped this spreadsheet into the chat pane, which you may or may not have seen. So if you do want to try and follow along with me, then please feel free to download that file and you can try and work along with me. If not, if I go a bit too fast, remember that this is being recorded and you can always use the recording and the practice file after this session. All right, so let's start out with the basics. So I have some data here, and it's not a particularly large data set. If I do Control down arrow to jump me to the last row, you can see that I have 702 rows of data. So not completely huge, but enough data for what we need to do today. I'm going to do Control up arrow to jump back up to the top. And what we have here is basically sales data for some products across a few different countries. And you can see here we have units sold, we have various different prices, we have some data that is primed for a pivot table. Now, currently, I don't have this data in a table. Now, my data is clean. I'm not going to go through the process of cleaning up data. We've done that in a webinar previously, which you can find on the Simon Says It YouTube channel if you want to learn how you can clean up your data prior to putting it into a pivot table. But the one thing I am going to do here is put this data into a table, one of the most important steps before you create your pivot table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Control A to highlight all of my data. Now, when it comes to formatting as a table, there are a few different options that you can use. You can go to your home ribbon, and in the styles group, you have a format as table drop down, so you can come in and you can select any one of these. A quicker way of doing it is to press the keyboard shortcut Control T, which is basically the create table shortcut. It's going to say, where is your table data? Now, I selected mine prior, so it's picking up all of my data. I'm going to say yes, my table has headers, click on OK, and that's now put my data into a table. Now, when I've clicked in my table, you can see that I get my table design contextual ribbon. And this is one of the reasons why I know that my data is in a table. And the first thing that I always like to do is I like to name my table. So in this first group where we have table name, instead of the generic table1, which isn't particularly meaningful, I'm going to change this to, let's say, product underscore data. Remember, when you are naming your tables or your pivot tables, you can't have any spaces in that table name. It has to be separated with an underscore, or you need to make it all one word. And don't forget to press enter, which is something I always forget to do in order to set that table name. So now I've done that, I'm going to put this data into a pivot table. Again, there are a few different ways that you can do this. You can jump up to Insert and select Pivot Table. But if you're already on the Table Design ribbon, you also have a Summarize with Pivot Table option just here, which is the one that I'm going to use. And you can see here it's picked up my product data range for my pivot table, which is fine. And I'm going to put this on a new worksheet and click on OK. So now we have a blank pivot table report. And for those of you that have used pivot tables before, this is probably fairly straightforward and easy for you so far. Now you'll see at the bottom, this is just called Sheet 1. I'm going to move this to the right-hand side of my data, just because I prefer it organized with my raw data first and then any of my pivot table worksheets afterwards. And currently I don't have anything in this pivot table. I've got my pivot table fields over on the right-hand side. And just a reminder that these pivot table fields are literally all of the column headings from your raw data. And to build my pivot table, I'm going to use these fields and drag them into these various areas underneath in order to build up my pivot table. So the first pivot table that I'm going to build is going to be, I want to see a list of all of the sales by product. So I'm going to grab my sales field, I'm going to drag it down and drop it into values. I'm going to grab my product field and I'm going to drop that down into rows. And you can see what that's done. I now have my products listed just here, and then I have the sum of all of the sales for those products, I should say, listed just there. Now, one thing you will notice when you drop sales into values, you can see that it's automatically done a sum of sales. Now, depending on the data that you're dropping into this values area, sometimes it might do a count, sometimes it might do a sum. And for me, it's decided that sum is the best one for this particular set of values. But what I could do is if I wanted to see maybe the number of items sold as opposed to the total value of sales, I could change this to count instead of sum. And there's a couple of different ways that I can do this. I can right click, I can go down to summarize values by, and I can change this to count. So that's going to show me the number of items I've sold, the number of products, as opposed to the value sum. Okay, I'm going to Control Z to come back out of there. The other way I could do this would be from this pivot table fields pane. So where I have sum of sales, if I click that little drop down arrow and go to value field settings, I could then choose count from there, and that's also going to change it to count. All right, so very straightforward. Control Z to come back out of there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename some of these column headings. So I'm going to widen these columns out a little bit. Now, these little headings up here, you don't have to keep what Excel names them. So if I wanted to, I could jump in here and just overtype with the name product and hit enter. And maybe I want to change sum of sales to say total sales. Okay, so don't be afraid to rename those column headings. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to do some formatting to this pivot table. And I've widened my columns out here a little bit, so I've got more room to work with. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to format these numbers so they look a little bit nicer. So these are values, they are monetary values, so I probably want to have a currency symbol on the front of these. Now, remember, when you're formatting these numbers, you might have a tendency to select them all, go to the Home ribbon, and then use your number formatting in the middle here. Now, it will work, it will apply, but remember that when you're working in a pivot table and you're moving fields around, when you apply this number formatting, it's going to apply it to the cells, so it might not necessarily move with your numbers if you start moving your fields around. So a much better way to do this to guarantee that you always have your currency symbol kept with your numbers is to right-click, go down to Value Field Settings, and select Number Format from here, and then select the number formatting that you want. So in this case, I'm going to say Accounting. I'm going to leave my symbol on US dollars, and I am going to take those decimal places down to 0. Click on OK, and click on OK again. And now I have my formatting applied. Now, I don't know if you noticed there, as soon as I applied that formatting, column B suddenly got a lot narrower. I'd widened this column out quite a way, but the column got narrower as soon as I changed that formatting. Now, this is something to watch out for if you don't like that. So sometimes if you set all of your columns to a certain width, and then you make a change and the columns resize themselves, sometimes that can be a little bit annoying. Now, you can control that just by modifying one of the options within pivot tables. So if we click in our data, go up to Pivot Table Analyze, and right in this first group underneath Options, on the Layout and Format tab here, you'll see at the bottom there's an option that says Auto Fit Column Widths on Update. So if you have that ticked, and I think for most people that will be ticked by default, it means that every time you make a change, Excel is going to change the column width so that it just fits in, it accommodates what you have within that particular cell. Now, if you set your columns to a specific width and you want to retain that, it's worth unticking this little option just here. And that column width is always going to stay the same. Now, you'll see in a moment the drawback of doing that, but I just wanted to highlight that little option because that is a question that I've been asked quite a lot when I've been training pivot tables. All right, so let's add another field in, and immediately you're going to see why sometimes doing that little option is not a good idea. So I'm going to go back to my fields, and I'm going to grab date, and I'm going to drop this down into columns. Now, immediately you can see that I have all of these hash symbols in here, and that's because the column isn't wide enough to accommodate whatever needs to go in there. Okay, and that is the drawback of essentially fixing your column widths. So what I'm probably going to do here is I'm going to widen my column widths manually, and I'm going to go back in and I'm just going to turn that option back on. Okay, so you've seen both sides of the coin there. It's up to you to decide if you like that option or if you don't. Now, one other thing that you might have noticed is that when I've dropped that date field into columns, I've got a whole host of other things. So it's not only added date, it's added a quarters field and a years field. Now, I didn't have a quarters field and a years field in my field list just here. But what Excel does is that if you have something like a date field, it looks at that date field and it says, okay, can I break this down into years, quarters, days? And if it can, it's going to give you those additional fields. And if you take a look at my pivot table, you can see now I have years listed at the top, 2018, 2019, and I have little plus icons next to them. And when I expand, I'm now seeing my data in quarters. And I can click the plus next to these just to widen them out, and then I get to see the different months underneath. So I can essentially drill down through the years, the quarters, and then into months. Now I'm going to collapse these back up again, and a quick way of doing that is if you go up to your Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, in this little active field group, you have these two little buttons here, collapse and expand field. So I'm going to say collapse to collapse those back up again. I'm going to say collapse again to get back to my years. Now, it might be that you just literally wanted the months listed there, and when you added that field, Excel added in all of these extra fields which you don't feel that you need. And that is absolutely fine. You can just get rid of any of the fields that you don't want. So I'm going to drag years out of here and also quarters, so I just get my dates showing in months, which is kind of what I wanted originally. Okay, so just be aware of that grouping. Now, actually, if I go back one level, hang on a second, I'm going to Control Z and Control Z again, because there's just one more thing I want to show you here. If when you have your items grouped like this, if you go up to Group Field, this is actually going to show you what it's going to add when you drag your date down. So mine's going to add months, quarters, and years. Now, if when I drag date, I want it to show just quarters and years, I can come in here and I can select that. Okay, so this little group field will show you what fields you're going to get basically when you drag your date down to there. All right, so I'm going to switch this back to just showing months, like so. All right, so that just explains a little bit about how Excel deals with grouping. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange my data fields a little bit. I'm going to drag date down into rows, and I think I'm going to put product into columns like so. So now I have my products running across the top, I have my months or my date running down the side, and then I have my values in the middle. And what you can probably see just here is that for one of these products, I have a lot of zero values. So for Marchesa, it looks like we only sold something in September, and the rest of these cells are blank. Now, if you start to do things like maybe create pivot charts based on this data, or maybe do things like spark lines, you'll find that having nothing in a cell can sometimes throw your data off, make your data look a little bit weird. I always think that if you have zero values or nothing in particular cells, it's always worth filling them with something, whether it's a zero or even some text if you wanted to. I wouldn't have absolutely nothing in those cells. So a quick way of doing this, again, is to go up to your Pivot Table Analyze ribbon. In the first group, we have Options. And again, on this Layout and Format tab, towards the bottom underneath Format, you can see here it says for empty cells, show, and then you can put in here what you want them to show. So that might be a piece of text. You might want it to say no data. In my case, I'm just going to say put a 0 in instead, which is just going to put a dash essentially there. Okay, so that means that it's still a value in there, so it's not going to, you're not going to get weird breaks in your spark lines or your charts or anything along those lines. Okay, so always good to add some kind of formatting to your zero values. Now, what I'm going to do here is I've got my pivot table. It looks reasonably good. I'm going to go in and I'm going to name my pivot table. So again, up to Pivot Table Analyze, in the first group, I just have the generic name of Pivot Table 1. Now, I always recommend, even though it does seem a little bit tedious, that you go through and you name any tables that you create, any pivot charts, any pivot tables. This is particularly important when you start to get into things like building dashboards, adding slices, because if you've got quite a lot of pivot tables going on and quite a lot of pivot charts, you're going to need to be able to identify those charts. So if you give them a name, it's a lot easier to identify them. Otherwise, they're just going to be called Pivot Table 1, Pivot Table 2, so on and so forth. So I'm going to name this pivot table, what shall we call this? We will call this sales by product, like so, and enter. All right, let's turn our focus a little bit towards design. And this tends to be something that people don't think about a great deal, but it is really important, particularly when it comes to the readability of your pivot table. Now, my pivot table is reasonably small, and I'm sure that I've seen very, very complex, large pivot tables. And the easier we can make it for people to interpret, understand, and analyze, the better. And sometimes formatting can really help with that. So it is worth thinking about. It's not just a pretty afterthought, it can help with the readability. Now, when it comes to formatting your pivot table, if we jump up to the design ribbon up here, we have numerous different options. So I can go into pivot table styles and I have different designs, different colors that I can apply to my pivot table. Now that's all well and good, but I am kind of limited to the options that Excel has decided I might want to use. It might also be that if you work for a company that maybe has some kind of house style or some kind of branding, and it's really important to them that you use specific colors even in your pivot tables and charts, then you might want to create your own pivot table style where you can utilize your own colors. And you can do that from here. At the bottom, you have new pivot table style. And this is where you can go in and you can customize every element of the pivot table to your liking. Now, I'm not going to go through and do all of these. I'm just going to show you a few different options and show you where it goes and how you apply it. So I'm going to call this just my initials and custom style. I then get to select different table elements. So you can see we've got a whole table, report filter labels, first column, header row, and you can customize each of these elements. So I might want to say that for my whole table, I'm going to click on Format. I want the background of this table to be a light grey colour. I might also say that I want an outline border around the outside of the entire table. I might then say that I want the, let's say, header row. I'm going to format that. I'm going to say I want that a green color and click on OK. And I'm going to go down to grand total row. I want that grand total row to be bold and click on OK. Now, I've just made a few changes there. You could go through every single one of these, changing the font color, font style, background fill, all of that, borders, everything. I'm just going to do a few little things there. Click on OK. And once you've done that, if you want to now apply that style that you've created, if you jump up to Pivot Table Styles, you'll see that you now have an additional group at the top called Custom. So any custom styles you create will appear up here. And I can then just select it, and I now have my custom style applied to my pivot table. Now, another question that I get asked really frequently is, if you create a custom style in one workbook and then you create yourself a new workbook, does that custom style carry across to the new workbook? And the answer there is unfortunately, no, it doesn't. This is very specific to the workbook that you're working in. So I can utilize it on other worksheets, but I can't utilize it in different workbooks. So if you do want to use your custom style in a completely different workbook, the workaround for this is to come into this workbook and essentially copy the pivot table into the new workbook. As soon as you do that, when you go into pivot table styles, you'll see that that style is then available. So you can apply it to your new pivot table in the new workbook and then delete out that pivot table that you copied across. Hopefully that makes sense. That is the workaround for getting that style to copy across to a new workbook. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. All right, let's now add in something else. We're going to add in another field. I'm going to add, what shall we add here? I'm going to add country, and I'm going to drop that down into rows. I'm actually going to put that above date, so it's organized like this. Now, another little thing you can do with regards to formatting is that you can add a blank row in between each change in item. And sometimes this can help quite a lot with the readability of your pivot tables. So again, on this design ribbon, you have a blank rows option. If you click the drop down, I can say insert blank line after each item, and it's going to put a blank line in there, so it just separates it out. Now with this style that I've applied, it's not particularly too obvious, so I might actually go in and let's change this to something else. What shall we do? Something like that. So now you can see that blank line a little bit clearer, and it just gives a little bit of separation to each item in your data. Hopefully that's all making sense to everybody so far. All right, now let's remove date. And I'm also going to remove product from here. So we just get back to our countries. Actually, I'm going to remove country and replace that with product. So we have our product and our total sales listed. Now, when it comes to things like sorting and filtering within your pivot tables, there's quite a few different things that you can do here. So currently, I don't have these sorted, but if I did want to sort my values so that I had the product with the highest amount of sales at the top, all I need to do is right-click, go to sort, and I can sort largest to smallest. So I can see there that the Vermont product is my top seller, essentially. Now, something else that I can do here is if I wanted to see maybe just the top 3 products, I could apply a top 10 filter. So if we click on product dropdown, go to values, you'll see right at the bottom here in my filters, I have this filter for top 10. Now, if you had lots and lots and lots of different products, you might want to see what the top 10 products were by sales. I don't, I only have a few. So I want to see what the top 3 products are. So I can take that down, click on OK, and it's going to show me those top 3 products. Okay, again, hopefully that makes sense to everyone. All right, so I'm actually going to clear this filter out. And am I going to do it by product this time? Yeah, I think I'm going to stay by doing this with product. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a pivot chart. And I'm going to show you some options that you have when it comes to your pivot charts. So I'm going to jump up to my pivot table analyze ribbon, and you'll see on this ribbon you have an option for a pivot chart. So let's click on pivot chart. I have a whole host of different charts that I can select, but I'm just going to do a very basic column chart in this example. Now I'm going to do a little bit of basic formatting on here. Now when you insert your charts, you're going to get these little grey filter buttons. So these help you filter essentially directly from your chart. Now I don't tend to use these filters. I tend to filter using my pivot table over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to say hide all field buttons on charts. Generally, when I'm creating my charts, I like to keep them as clean as possible. I don't like to have lots of unnecessary things on my chart. I like people to be able to see exactly the data that I want them to see. Now, looking at my chart, one thing I also don't need on here for this particular data series is I don't really need my total over in the legend. It's not really performing any kind of function. Now, this is just a text box, so I can click on it, press delete, and get rid of that little text box. I'm going to add a quick title, so double click in my chart title, and I'm going to call this Sales by Product, like so. And I'm going to make this chart a little bit flatter, so these bars are a little bit flatter, and widen that out a little bit. Now, when it comes to formatting your pivot charts, you have a whole host of different options. Now, one thing I will say is you need to be careful where you're clicked on your chart when it comes to formatting. And one good way to keep track of where you're clicked is if you go up to your pivot chart format ribbon, which is now displaying at the top, in the first group, it will show you where you're currently clicked. So I'm clicked on the outside of my chart, so it's telling me I'm clicked in the chart area. If I click on where the grid lines are, you can see that that changes to plot area. If I click on my data bars, it's showing me it's clicked on the total series. So this really matters when it comes to formatting, because I can't tell you how many times I think I'm formatting my data bars and I'm clicked on the plot area. Okay, so you can, if you want to, select the part of the chart you want to format from this drop down as well. Sometimes people find that a little bit easier, just to select it from here. Now I'm going to apply a little bit of formatting to what we have. I'm going to click on these data bars and I'm going to change the color just by using the palette. I'm going to change those to red. Now if I want to make some other changes specifically to this data series, I can right click and you'll find that I have more options underneath Format Data Series. So anything on your chart, if you right click, you're going to have more options in the right click menu. And you can see here, I can choose to change the gap width of my bars. So I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to essentially make my bars a little bit wider by changing the gap width. And click on OK. Now, another thing I might want to do here is, because I like to remove lots of information just to keep it nice and clean, I'm going to remove this axis, these values in this axis, by clicking Delete. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to add those values as data labels on my chart. So I'm going to jump up to the Design ribbon. And if you want to add what we call a chart element, we have this first option just here, where we can do things like add axes titles, chart titles, so on and so forth. So if you want to label up your chart with the values, you can select data labels and choose where you want those values to sit. Now I'm going to have mine on the outside end, and that kind of really gets rid of the need for having that axis running down the side. And I can very clearly see that data and the values. So just a few little formatting tips that you have there. Now, another thing you might want to do when it comes to formatting your charts is you can do things like add pictures, you can add patterns, just to add interest to your chart. We want to make our charts nice and visual, but we don't want to add so much formatting that it's overwhelming or too busy and we lose the point of the data. But I'm just going to show you very quickly how you can work with textures just to make this chart a little bit more interesting. Again, I'm going to click on this plot area, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to say Format Plot Area. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a fill. I'm going to add a picture or texture fill. So if I wanted to put a picture in the background here, I could choose to insert a picture that I have saved off locally. I'm actually going to add a texture, and I'm just going to choose this one just here, and I'm going to adjust the transparency to take that all the way down. So it's just very faint, it's not distracting from the data, but it just makes it a little bit more interesting, like so. I then might decide that I want to actually change this chart area background, go up to Format, Shape Fill, and I'm going to give that just a light grey colour just there. So slightly more interesting to look at than it was at the beginning. Now you could go to town with this, I'm not going to linger too much longer on chart formatting, but in case you haven't seen these used in charts before, there is a newer feature called icons, and if you go to the insert ribbon, you have icons underneath illustrations. I've seen a lot of people using icons in their charts these days. So I'm going to just do a quick search for, let's say, money. And I'm actually not money. Let's add shopping in there, make it a bit more relevant. And let's just add this little shopping cart icon. Click on insert. I'm going to resize this down just by holding down shift and dragging in that corner. And I might want to add that as a little point of interest onto my chart. Now, mine doesn't look amazing where I've put it, but I've seen these used really nicely and effectively in charts and also for interactive dashboards as well. So expand your mind a little bit when it comes to creativity when you're working with your pivot charts. Okay, let's move on to the next item. Now, I'm going to create essentially a copy of this worksheet, and if I'm creating lots of different pivot tables and pivot charts, I quite like to use this method. Instead of going back to my data and creating another pivot chart from here, or pivot table from here I should say, sometimes if I already have one, I just like to copy the worksheet. So a quick way of doing that is to go down to where it says Sheet 1, hold down Control, drag and drop, and that's going to make a copy of that particular worksheet. Now, I'm going to just go back and name this one so I don't get confused. This is sales by product, like so. And I'm not sure what I'm going to name this one yet, but I am going to delete out the table. Okay, so now I have a new copy. Now what I want to talk through is how you can use things like summarizing values and showing values as. Now what I mean by this is you can add data into your pivot table that essentially doesn't exist in the original source data. So currently I'm looking at my different products and I'm looking at the total sales for those products. But what if I wanted to see what the average sales are for these products? Well, I can do that. All I need to do is grab my sales field again. I'm going to drag it down and drop it in values. So you can essentially add the same field multiple times into the same area. And what I could then choose to do is I could right click and say summarize values by, and I want to see the average. Okay. Now, this looks different to this column because I haven't applied the same number formatting. And you have to go back in every single time, unfortunately, and apply the relevant number formatting. So for me, that's a counting format. I'm going to take that down to 0, like so. And I might want to change this to just average sales, like so. So very quickly, I've added in something which isn't in the original source data, the average sales. I could do the same thing as we saw earlier for count. I could add another sales field down here. I can right click, I can say summarize values by, and I can see the count, which is going to give me the number of items that I've sold. And again, I might want to change this to count of sales. Okay. Now, something else I could do here is I could do something like, let's drag another sales field down here. I might choose to, or I might want to have this showing as the percentage of the total. So I might want to see what percentage each of these products make up of the total. So again, I just need to right click. And this time, I'm going to go down to Show Values As. And in here, I have all different calculations that I can perform. So I can do things like see the difference from certain fields. I can see the percentage of the row total. But for this one, I'm going to say I want to see what the percentage is of the grand total. And there we go. Now, again, I'm going to jump in and I'm just going to reformat this a little bit. I'm going to right click, down to value field settings, into number format, and this time we're dealing with a percentage, and what I want to do here is just take these decimal places down to 0. So now I can very clearly see that Vermont makes up 28% of all sales, and Marquesa makes up 1% of all sales. All right, so very quickly, I've managed to add in all of these different fields which weren't necessarily part of my original data. So my analysis has got a lot deeper simply by knowing a few commands in Excel. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. I know I'm going reasonably quickly. It's quite a lot to take in. Now, something else you might want to do here, and this again is just touching on something that you may have used previously, and that is conditional formatting. Now, you can use conditional formatting within your pivot tables, but you need to apply it in a slightly different way than if you were applying it to just maybe a regular table or just a list of numbers. So if I wanted to apply conditional formatting to any of these fields, or maybe this total sales field, what I would need to do would be to, I'm going to highlight this field just here. I'm going to select the top one in total sales. I'm going to go to conditional formatting, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's do a new rule. Now, the reason why I'm doing it this way is that when you do a new rule, this is going to be the option that you need to select all cells showing total sales values for products. Now, you don't get this when you're just applying conditional formatting to data that's not within a pivot table. So you want to select this bottom option, and then you can go in and select the conditional formatting that you want to use. So it might be that I want to use, let's say, a data bar. I'm going to say OK, and it's going to apply that to this particular area that I've selected. And it doesn't matter whether I move these fields around, that conditional formatting is going to move with the total sales. Okay? So you have to apply it in a slightly different way to what you would if it was just outside of a pivot table. Control Z to backtrack out of there. Now, something else that's quite interesting that you can do with your data, and this is along the same line of adding in fields that don't necessarily, or data that doesn't necessarily exist in your original data, is you can use something called calculated fields. Now, calculated fields allow you to perform calculations with your pivot table data using the fields, okay? Now, the easiest way for me to show you this is to just jump straight in to an example. Now, what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to go back to Pivot Table Analyze. Now, you can see that I've lost my pivot table field list just here. Now, if that ever happens to you and it doesn't come back when you click inside your pivot table, you just need to click this field list button on the end here in the show group to bring your pivot table fields list back again. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to remove some of these fields that I created. Just take all of those out. So I just get back to my product and my total sales. Now, what I might want to do, and I'm not sure how realistic of an example this particularly is, but I might want to say that for all sales that are over, let's say, 27 million, I want to apply a 20% sales tax. So this is where I would utilize calculated fields. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually sort my data. I'm going to sort it largest to smallest. So essentially, because this data set is quite small, I can see that these values are all over 27 million, and these ones are under 27 million. So what I would expect is that once I've done this calculated field, I would expect to see what the sales tax is for these top ones, but not for these ones, because they're going to fall under 27 million. So let's go in and add our calculated field. I'm going to jump up to Pivot Table Analyze, go to Fields, Items and Sets, and add a calculated field. So the first thing we need to do here is we need to have a name for our new field. Now, this is going to be a 20% sales tax, so I'm going to call this sales. We then need to construct our formula. So there's numerous different formulas that you can use in calculated fields. And whilst this isn't a training session on Excel formulas and functions, just be aware that you can use them within here. The only difference is if you were using a formula or a function outside of calculated fields, if you're just using, I don't know, equals sum, then you would probably utilize cell references in order to construct your formula. Now, with a calculated field, you can't do that. You can't use cell references. You have to use your pivot table fields. So sometimes this takes a little bit of thought, but we can do it in this particular example. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to utilize an if statement or an if function to say if, open bracket. Now, if you have never used the if function before, then this might be a little bit confusing for you. But with the if function, the first argument is we need to perform a logical test. So what do I want to say here? I want to say if the sales total is greater than or equal to 27 million. That's my first logical test. So I'm going to say if, and I'm going to use my field, I'm going to use the sales field, if sales is greater than or equal to 27 million, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, comma. The next part of this formula is what I want Excel to do if that particular thing is true. So if the value is greater than or equal to 27 million, I want Excel to do the sales multiplied by 20%, comma. If that's not true, so if it's under, I want it to do nothing. Okay, now that is a very basic if statement. And again, if you've never used them before, then that might be something that you want to look up. But I just really want to show you how you can utilize it within calculated fields. So now when I click on OK, you can see I now get a new column and it's worked out that sales tax for everything that's above 27 million, and for everything that's under, I have nothing in there. And I could come in here and change that just to say sales tax if I wanted to. Now, if you get this little message pop up, pivot table field name already exists when you're renaming, all you need to do is you can cheat a little bit here, put a space on the end, hit enter, and Excel thinks you've typed in a completely different heading name. Now I could go a stage further here and then just do an addition of the total sales and the sales tax. So again, I can utilize a calculated field. I'm going to call this total including tax. And this is going to be a straightforward sum. So we're going to say sales plus. The good thing about this is that as soon as you create a calculated field, it's now available as a field for you to use. So I can say sales tax, okay, and then I get that totals column at the end. So I've been able to do a greater analysis of my pivot table data, again, just by knowing a few little tips and tricks to really get what I want to see out of my data. Hopefully that's all making sense. We've covered a lot in there. I understand completely if your mind is a little bit, whoa, what's going on? I would recommend that you do go through this webinar again with the worksheet, and you can pause it and stop it and kind of really take stock of what you're doing as you go along. Now we're going to move on, and just bear with me 1 second. I just need to take a sip of water. There we go. Now we've got about 10 minutes or so left, and I really do want to get to showing you dynamic chart labels, because again, this is something that I get asked about quite a lot. Now I'm going to, where should we do this? I'm going to stay on this spreadsheet, and I'm going to remove some of these things that we've added. And I am just going to have, let's see, do I want my rows, my product? Yes, I do. So I'm going to stick with this data that I have just here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do exactly what we did previously. I'm going to create a very quick pivot chart. And I'm not going to do anything fancy with this particular pivot chart. I'm going to do a bog standard column chart again. I'm just going to remove these little labels, remove this just here, like so. And I'm going to leave it at that. The main point of this section is not really formatting the chart, it's using dynamic labels. Now, you might be wondering what a dynamic label is. Well, what it is basically I'm going to add a slicer in here in a moment. And in fact, let's do that first of all. I'm going to add a little slicer. And if you've never used slicers previously, these are basically like filters which will help you filter your pivot table and your pivot chart. And you'll see when I've tried to insert a slicer, we get all of our column headings in here, and we can literally choose which ones we want to add slicers for. Now for me, I'm going to add, I think we're going to add a country slicer. And click on OK. I'm going to drag this over here and just make that a little bit tidier. So what we're going to do here is, or what I'm aiming for, is that I want to be able to make a selection in this slicer and have the chart title update. So I want this chart to basically say sales by product, and then underneath I wanted to say Brazil, or maybe India, or maybe Japan, or maybe a combination of whatever I have selected in this slicer. So you'll see when I click on Brazil, my pivot table and my pivot chart update, and it's now only showing the sales for Brazil. I can select multiple items, I can select Brazil and India, and now I'm seeing that data reflected in my pivot table and pivot chart. So essentially my title needs to look at this slicer, see what I've selected, and update itself depending on what my selection is. And that is what we call a dynamic chart label. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to put one together, and I'm going to try and do this reasonably quickly. I will say this process looks reasonably lengthy, and it is definitely one you need to practice a few times. Now, the way that I like to do this, or the way that I find it easiest, is I like to create a new little worksheet, and I'm going to call this Helper. Sometimes I like to put in these little helper worksheets where I do kind of all the messy work, and then I can copy it back to the sheet that I want to use essentially. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do here is, in fact, I'm going to add some titles so I know what I'm looking at. I'm going to add the word slicer up here, and then I'm going to let's add the word title, subtitle, and then I'm going to say pivot table down here. So this is my helper worksheet. It's where I'm going to be doing all of my working out. So I'm going to jump back to my charts, and I'm going to grab this slicer. I'm going to do a Control X to cut it, and I'm going to paste it onto my helper worksheet. I'm just going to place it underneath there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little pivot table, and all this pivot table is going to show is basically the information that I have in this slicer. Okay, so I'm going to jump all the way back to my original data. I'm going to go to Table Design, Summarize with Pivot Table, and this time I'm going to put my pivot table on an existing worksheet. And that existing worksheet is going to be Helper. I'm going to put it down here in cell A22 and click on OK. So this is going to give me a blank pivot table, and the only field I'm going to put in here, as I said, is the country field. So I'm going to grab country and I'm going to put it down into columns so that I now have my country running across here. I'm going to close that down. You can see that by default I have grand total on the end here. I'm going to just turn that off by jumping back up to design, going to grand totals and saying off for rows and columns. So this is what I wanted. I basically wanted my country names just listed in a row like this. Okay, now I know this appears very confusing at the moment. Hopefully it will all be tied together in a second. So now that I have set this up, what I want to do is I want to create a title and a subtitle that's going to be used on my chart. So the first title that I want is I want this chart to say sales by product. So that's fairly simple. I'm just going to add in here sales by product. Straightforward. And what we're going to do in a moment is we're essentially going to link the chart title to pick up this sales by product. But what I want is underneath sales by product, I want the subtitle to be whatever country I have selected in this slicer. Now that could be Brazil, it could be India, it could be Japan, it could be any combination of all of these. I might have Brazil, UK and USA selected. So this is where we need to use a little function. And for this, and let me zoom in a little bit so you can see it a little bit clearer, I'm going to use a new function that's available in Excel, and this is available in Excel 2019 and also Office 365. Now, I will point out an alternative if you're using an earlier version, but this is a good demonstration of one of the brand new functions that we have available in Excel. And it's called text join. And what this does is it's very similar to concatenate. And in fact, concatenate would be what you would use if you don't have access to this text join function in the version of Excel that you're using. And what concatenate and text join do is they allow you to essentially join pieces of text together. So I'm going to open my bracket. The first argument I have here is delimiter. Now a delimiter is where I specify how I want each word separated. So in my subtitle, if I've selected Brazil, India and Japan, how do I want those words separated? Do I want a space in between? Do I want a comma? Do I want something else? Now for me, I want those words separated by a comma and then a space. So my first argument here, I need to put it in quote marks, is comma, space, quote mark. My next argument is, do I want Excel to ignore empty cells? Now, I'm going to type in true here. I'm going to come back to this in a moment after we've done the third argument because I think it will make a little bit more sense. Comma. And now I need to select this row just here, which contains my column labels essentially. So what I'm saying here is I've specified my delimiter, how I want these spaced out in the title. I've told the subtitle to use whatever I have listed in here, because remember this is a pivot table that's controlled by this slicer. So whatever I select up here, this is going to change, okay? And because I've selected the entire row, I've said to Excel to ignore empty cells. That is what this true argument is, because I've got the whole row selected and a lot of these cells are empty, okay? Close my bracket, hit enter. And like magic, we have Brazil, India, Japan, UK, USA. So what I would expect to happen here is if I start clicking around on my slicer, I would expect this subtitle to change. Now let's click. It doesn't change. Now why is that? Well, it's because we haven't actually linked this slicer to this pivot table. I'm going to click on my slicer, up to the slicer ribbon, and we have a report connections button. And this is where you can go in and you can start linking your slicer to the different pivot tables. And this is going to show you any pivot tables and pivot charts that you have in your workbook. So just for quickness, I'm going to just select both, click on OK. And now when I click, can you see it's changing down here because this is controlling the pivot table and the pivot table is linked to the subtitle. So now I can select multiple things and we have them with a comma space in between. All right. So now that we've done all that, we can essentially jump back to our title over here. I'm going to click in the chart title at the top. I'm going to say equals in the formula bar. And I'm going to select title. So now it says sales by product. And I want to have the country appearing underneath. So what I'm going to do here is insert a text box. And we're just going to put this, let's make this quite large, somewhere underneath. And again, click in the formula bar, type in equals. I'm going to go back to here, select the cell, enter, and it's going to give me those names. Now I can do some fiddling around here. I want to put it underneath, and I'm going to move this plot area down so we have a bit more room. And if you want to center these, there isn't really a great way of centering them. You just kind of have to make this text box the length or the width of the chart, and then you can center them on the page, give it a little bit more room. And of course you can jump in here and you can start formatting this title, making it look really nice. So the final thing I do here would be to copy this slicer back onto the other page. So Control X to cut. I'm going to copy it back over here. Now hopefully what we should see is if I click India, it's going to change. So we now have a dynamic chart title happening, which I think is actually pretty cool. And yeah, I wanted to show that to you because it utilized a few different things. We got to see some charts, we got to see some slices in action, and we also got to see that new function of text join. Again, this is something which you might need to practice that a little bit, but once you've got it clear in your head, it's actually reasonably simple. Now, I will say that once you've done all this working out on your little helper area, you can't delete this worksheet because everything is linked to here essentially. But what you could do is you could go through and just hide that particular worksheet so no one can see all of your workings out. Okay. So there we go. We've got to, yeah, we're just about at 7:30. Hopefully I've thrown enough in there that was useful to you. There are so many more things that I could have gone through with you, but I just wanted to cherry pick a few of them.